Hi, this is Swapnil Bharti and we are here at the Spinnaker Summit in Seattle, and today we have with us Andrew from Google. Before we deep dive into this interview, can you just tell us a bit about yourself? What do you do at Google?
Sure. So my name is Andrew Phillips. I'm a product manager in Google Cloud, working in the area of CI/CD and releases and rollouts in general, and that means that I work very closely with the Google team that works on Spinnaker. So as a short form, you might say that I'm the product manager for Google's Spinnaker effort.
Was there a challenge in terms of continuous delivery, or people were just doing their own, do-it-yourself thingy, or there were solutions? So what I want to understand is where does Spinnaker fit, that suddenly it's gaining adoption and it's becoming popular?
Yeah, the irony is that, so software delivery is always both solved and unsolved at the same time. It's solved because over time we build up an increasingly large set of best practices that we try to achieve. But it's also unsolved because every 5 minutes we seem to invent some new runtime platform to which we want to deploy. So Spinnaker obviously, was originally designed, if you like, as the solution for the problem of deployment to virtual machine-based groups as company were trying to move to the cloud. And you could argue that that's almost a solved problem now, but of course, as an industry, we've unsolved that problem by now looking at other runtime technologies such as, say, Kubernetes, where once again everything is up in the air, and once again everybody is trying to find out how they're supposed to do things. And so I think one of the unique advantages of a tool like Spinnaker is that it can bring experience of the incorporated best practices, but also figure out how to apply them in a new space. And to be clear, I think whilst it might be Kubernetes today, in 3 months, 3 years, 3 whatever, it could be something totally different again. And so, over time, the benefits that a tool like Spinnaker has in terms of what it provides out of the box are just going to increase, because we will always try to take some of the lessons that we've learned and apply them next time around.
Right. So while you're talking about lessons, what lessons have you seen customers or users have learned, or you yourself, as part of community have learned?
So I think there's a couple of really interesting things worth bearing in mind. One is that Spinnaker as a tool is very clearly focused on what most people perceive as the back end of the CI/CD pipeline. Most people think of CI/CD as, you've got code at the beginning and then you put lots of stuff in and then ta-da, production. But the reality, if you look at most large companies and many different situations, is that you have the developer feedback cycle at the beginning, which is about, I'm about to push a code change, tell me something about it. And then you have the rollout to production cycle at the back, which is, I have a release candidate, make it get to production safely. And those are very different processes. And I think one of the valuable lessons in Spinnaker is that it definitely makes sense, certainly at a large scale, to have a tool that is dedicated to the back end of the pipeline and that is really focused on solving the kind of problems that happen in that area. Such as, safe rollouts. What are the times of day in which I can do rollouts? How can I put in safeguards to prevent teams accidentally shutting off all applications so that there's nothing serving user traffic? How do I ensure standardization and compliance? How do I even do proper access control? Because if you look at the front of the pipeline, that's typically where developers have to have a lot of control, because they have to determine how their code gets built, how they want to run their unit tests, all these kind of things. So to have one tool that tries to be both incredibly developer accessible and also standardized and compliant is very, very difficult. So I think one of the main lessons indeed is that Spinnaker, it makes sense to have a tool for the rollout part and a tool for the developer part. I think there's other important lessons in Spinnaker which we keep relearning as an organization, as an industry, which is that in order to do deployments at scale, you need some level of abstraction below what the base framework is. There's always going to be some people in your organization that understand all the details, from the chip to the hypervisor to Kubernetes and all the way up. But if you're an application developer, in most companies, you want to write some code, you want to hit save, and you just want things to work. And Spinnaker has some very interesting and nice abstractions in how it describes applications so that you can reason about them in some sense independent of the underlying runtime.
Right. And while you're talking about some of these lessons learned, personally, what are the key areas that you're like, oh, these are the areas I'm interested in, I want to solve these problems for the community?
Well, I mean, I would like to solve the problems that I see customers facing, and also challenges that aren't well solved yet. So I think at this present moment in time, one of the big challenges we're seeing is what is the right abstraction layer for something like Kubernetes, given that that's the runtime most people are trying to work with right now. And also, how do we incorporate some new ideas that aren't that new, but that have been brought into the mainstream, if you like, with Kubernetes. So specifically what I normally call environments as code. So the idea that rather than just having a pipeline that does arbitrary things, and then at the end of the pipeline, your production environment is changed, we actually keep track of the changes we want to make by storing them in a repository. But if you have to do that by hand, as a lot of people are trying to do, there's lots of things that can go wrong. There's lots of, very few fail-safes. People need to know very low-level details. And I think a tool like Spinnaker can do an excellent job of both managing this underlying new idea and providing the right level of higher value information to a team. So that, for instance, if you look at a pull request or if you look at an approval, should we deploy the staging, rather than just looking at a diff between two text files and trying to understand what that means, you are told, well, what the team is trying to do, it's trying to go from version X of the application to version Y. These are the code diffs that are in that deployment. These are the test results that have been passed, etc., etc. So that's the kind of value a tool like Spinnaker can provide.
One thing that is unique about Spinnaker, and I'm sure there same a lot of other open source projects share the same, is that the balance between users versus vendor is totally different. There are more users than vendors. I think right now Google and Netflix, they are two big players which are like putting in. So how does it really affect? Because even if you look at Kubernetes, it was something that was already been used internally and then open sourced. So it has already proved itself, and same is the case with Spinnaker. So when it comes to the confidence that users have, how much role does it play, or what is your kind of insight that users are confident about this technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think an excellent point. And to be clear, I think you mean contributors and not just vendors. So Spinnaker is interesting in that,
yes.
If you look at the evolution of maturity of most open source projects, there's indeed the background, where does it come from? And then there is the growth, when you see not just the original creator, but other companies and teams working and contributing. And Spinnaker's definitely been through that phase. But then you have the next step, which is typically that successful projects start attracting a level of commercial interest and involvement where, typically VCs or investors are willing to put money on the line to fund a commercial ecosystem around a tool. And I'm pleased to say that that's essentially where we are today with the Spinnaker community, as you see both the major cloud providers contributing actively to the user base, but also you start to see a growth of a sort of little commercial ecosystem of vendors to help companies with their on-premise needs, for instance, or on-premises needs. I think confidence is ultimately a matter of two things. One is the code itself good enough? Can I use it? Will it fall over at any point in time? And I think Spinnaker has been battle tested long enough that really shouldn't be the point. I think there are definitely still challenges around how much deep knowledge and expertise you need to have to run Spinnaker well. And we have work to do to make that easier. But personally, I'm always more confident if I know that the thing that is a friction point for me right now is just that I don't have enough knowledge, versus the feeling that the tool itself can't actually support what I want to do. And then of course the other part is robustness of the tool, of the code, but also how long will it survive? How long will it be around? Can I have confidence that in 4 or 5 years' time, I can still get support for this tool, that it still will be maintained, and so on and so forth? And that is largely a function of both the contributor ecosystem and the vendor ecosystem. And I think in both areas, it's legitimate to say that Spinnaker has great support in both directions, and so people should not be concerned that Spinnaker is going to be gone anytime soon. In fact, on the opposite, on the contrary, I think that as the Kubernetes ecosystem kind of settles down, and as more large companies start figuring out how they can deploy to Kubernetes at scale, we will see yet another uptick in Spinnaker adoption and more interest in companies supporting Spinnaker going forward.
While you're talking about uptake in the adoption, this is it's second Spinnaker Summit, but it's like kind of the first one. So what are the trends that you have seen in the last 1 year?
So yeah, I mean, well, I think if we look at, so last year was definitely still, a bunch of, friends, but also a bunch of people who are all in the know, coming together, at Netflix to have a sort of fun session. This year, indeed, as you said, it's a proper quote unquote grown-up conference. We're at a very nice venue. We have lots and lots of visitors and attendees from lots of different places. I think a very healthy sign is that we have a bunch of people attending who are not necessarily that knowledgeable about Spinnaker. They are still investigating it, they are considering it, and that is a sign of a growing ecosystem. I think there's also a bunch of large companies involved who are starting to share their experience but are looking to expand. I think if you look at, I've been through a bunch of these kind of ecosystem growth phases. The beginning ones are always the ones where everyone knows everyone and everyone is an expert. And I think this year we're very much seeing there are a bunch of core experts, a bunch of long-standing users who want to learn more, and then a bunch of other people who are coming and who are interested. And of course, that means that we have to rethink how, what kind of content we present at these events, but that's a great sign for the growth of the ecosystem in general.
And what is, we have touched upon that, but what is driving this, growth and adoption?
So I think there's a couple of things. One, and I've mentioned this a few times already, obviously it's the sort of the maturity curve of a tool like Kubernetes. Spinnaker, I think very clearly is aimed at the end of the deployment spectrum where more complicated use cases sit. If you're a small team, or if you're running through a code lab, or if you're 5 or 10 people in a startup, Spinnaker probably isn't the tool for you right now. Not because it's not usable or because it can't do what you want, but because it brings a bunch of abstractions, a bunch of concepts that you have to learn. And if you're a small team, more tools is always worse in some sense. You try to use the smallest amount of automation necessary to get things done. And so I think as Kubernetes was, or any new runtime, as it's still young and is growing, that first wave of initial adopters are people who are just messing around. They're trying to make things work and they're not looking for any additional complexity if they can avoid it. What we're seeing right now is that wave is giving way to, Fortune 500 companies making big bets on something like Kubernetes, and then they start asking themselves, okay, now we need some serious tooling so that we can support thousands of developers, and maybe we can also support our hybrid or multi-cloud setup so that we can migrate effectively to something like Kubernetes, etc., etc. So I think, what I basically said is we're seeing adoption that's sort of crossed the chasm of a new runtime, pushing the enterprise use case. We're seeing a lot of resurgence and ongoing interest on multi-cloud and migration strategies. We're getting to a point where companies made their initial move to one cloud. Now they have a little bit of an understanding what it means to be a cloud, I wouldn't say cloud native, but a company that runs in the cloud. Now they're starting to ask themselves, how many clouds do I need? Which cloud is best for my choice? And so we're seeing a whole bunch of people looking at Spinnaker because they like the idea of being able to move from one platform to another platform without necessarily having to redo all their surrounding tooling. So I think that's another big second driver.
We have mentioned Kubernetes, and today the question is not who is using it, like who is not using it and why not. So what kind of symbiotic relationship is going to be there between Kubernetes and Spinnaker going forward?
I think that depends a little bit on how far the Kubernetes community wants to go in supporting deployment. I think we see some questions. People, when they look at something like a Spinnaker or indeed any deployment tool, they say, wait, but Kubernetes already has a deployment object. And you need to have some deeper understanding of what the use cases are that are supported by both to understand when you need each. So I think the symbiotic relationship, largely one of the questions will be defining that handover point. Kubernetes is a runtime like any runtime, whether it was OpenShift or Pivotal or Heroku or whatever, will need to support some level of deployment out of the box. But I think as of now, they are being very smart in saying, we're not going to try and support every type of deployment out of the box, because that's a very hard and complex problem. And if you open that trapdoor, you end up rebuilding a lot of functionality. So I think as companies start to work on more complex deployment scenarios, as they try to support, I don't know, we have a Target, one very, very big user, spoke publicly at Cloud Next, Google Cloud Next recently at San Francisco, about how they deploy to 1,800 Kubernetes clusters. That kind of rollout pattern is something that you will need to control out of the box. I think at the same time, we will see that as projects like Istio try to figure out how they can support application rollout, as a Spinnaker community, we have a lot of knowledge to give back to help them understand what users are actually trying to do when they want traffic manipulation as part of a rollout pattern. And in fact, we're engaged with the Istio team right now to figure out, work on missing features or missing functionality that would allow such a rollout pattern to work really smoothly.
So that also makes me wonder that, because whether you talk about multi-cloud or cloud native, depends on what you want. There is so much cross-pollination or interaction happening between among different projects. So from Spinnaker's perspective, right now it's kind of a standalone project. It is becoming, you are coming up with a governance model around it. But do you think it will also make sense for it to be part of a foundation or organization so that there is better pollination?
So yeah, I think in some sense these two questions are a little bit distinct. I think cross-pollination or bringing in of ideas is largely a factor of how integrated a tool is in the surrounding communities, and of course how easy it is for people in surrounding communities to contribute. And as you mentioned, and I think there'll be much more to be said about this topic, governance is a very important step in that direction. What a foundation does or does not add to this is a slightly different discussion, in the sense that, yes, there's some branding, there's some legal, there's some marketing assistance and so on. But I think from the perspective of figuring out Spinnaker's place in the continuous delivery world, I think governance is maybe a more important step in terms of actually making things happen. And I think there's an interesting subtlety here around, Spinnaker is already highly integrated with other tools. So for instance, we see there's ongoing work right now to make a better end-to-end artifact tracing story between Jenkins and Spinnaker, for instance. There's commercial offerings that pre-bundle things like Spinnaker and Jenkins and a bunch of other things together. So Spinnaker always has been a tool that has rich integrations into surrounding tools. I think there is definitely an interesting question going forward, especially as we consider things like, environments as code or describing the state of an environment, whether there are things we can use that are sort of de facto industry standard as a way of describing these, which Spinnaker could then consume, or whether Spinnaker uses other tools as part of what it does itself. I think these are all fascinating questions that we as a community will want to figure out. And of course, the more users and the more contributors we have that have experience of these other tools, the more interesting the joint work is that we can do in this area.
One interesting thing about Kubernetes and that I like about it, that they have a very tight focus. Mostly we have seen with a lot of open source projects, I don't want to name them, that they get so overwhelmed with the adoption and users that they lose focus of where they were heading and they get bloated and they have to fix. So what lesson is Spinnaker community, not lesson because it's too early phase, but what is your kind of strategy going forward that, you are going to have this either tight focus, or what is going to be your focus as, if you look at it 1 or 2 years from now?
Yeah, the breadth versus depth question is of course a very, very interesting one. And then, even Kubernetes, which is keeping a relatively narrow focus, of course, has added a whole bunch of extension points, because you have to have some answer typically to all the questions that the crazy things that people want to do, like, can I get my cluster to make an espresso? I think for Spinnaker, my personal view is that breadth meaning should Spinnaker cover the entire pipeline, is going to be difficult because, as I said earlier, I think it makes sense to focus on the delivery part separately from the code automation part. And in some sense, of course, Spinnaker has the same answer that Kubernetes or other tools have, is because it supports arbitrary automation, you can do anything with Spinnaker. I think where its value lies is in supporting specific challenges around, understanding what is in your runtime environment, remediating differences if they actually show up, allowing you to enforce policy, allowing you to have a rich way of defining the rollout process but also controlling it so the teams don't necessarily get to do everything. And so I think in that sense, if there are, the depth that we are looking for is around manageability, scalability, integrations with other DevOps tools in this ecosystem, as opposed to trying to make Spinnaker, the DevOps in a box tool. Because I think if you look at the Spinnaker user base, who are by and large pretty experienced, platform engineers, release engineers, those kind of people, they all know that DevOps in a box doesn't actually exist. And so I don't think we would have a credible story if we tried to do that.
So let's just stop talking about technology for a while and talk about you. When you're not, doing the Spinnaker, what do you do in your free time?
What do I do in my free time? Well, I try to look at a computer as little as possible, because I spend, when I'm not, I do a little bit of open source pull request reviewing, which just about works because my wife is also in tech and so she understands. But by and large, I try to cook, I try to go skydiving, I try to play squash, I try to do things that take me a little bit away from tech. I have an ongoing project that I probably won't get around to soon, which is to try to explain what it is that I actually do in such a way that my parents can understand. Because I think one of the funny things about working in tech, of course, is that if you typically speak to any one of your relatives or people like that, most of them have no idea what it is that we do, certainly when we talk about deployment or delivery. And I think that's very ironic, because actually, if you think about delivering t-shirts, or if you think about delivering food, or if you think about any other delivery process, most people understand all the details of what goes on, or a lot of the complexities of these processes. And we kind of make things very special and hard for ourselves by talking about, manifests and compilation and testing and repositories and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot we can do to make what we do more accessible and more approachable. And hopefully we will also learn a little bit from other industries that have solved very similar problems already.
So have you ever tried to explain it to your parents that what you do or no?
Well, I've tried a few times. We're getting better every single time.
So can you approach them from end user's point of view, like in case of Spinnaker, you can just simply, you're watching a Netflix movie, and your movie never goes down, or whether you're traveling or whatever. So you can approach from different perspective altogether, and what they understand. And then sometimes when people ask me, I said, okay, so we are in the Lyft or Uber, so when I call a Uber, it explains so I try to explain the very basics that they understand, like computer, when you open a word processor, you can, so that's what it is. So every time somebody asks, okay, you're a tech journalist, but what do you do? So I try to explain from that, and sometimes they understand.
No, exactly. I think the interesting is, this could be a very long conversation. It's a very fun one for me, but I think one of the biggest challenges I always have is to explain the concept of server-side software. Like, most people have a decent understanding because they know what it is to have a device of your own and to have stuff running on it. But to understand this idea that there is, you have this sort of strange window into software called a browser, and it is looking at things that happen elsewhere, is very strange for people, finding good analogies for that. And of course, if we talk about, especially Spinnaker, that tends to be focused on delivering server-side software. Although, and going back to our earlier discussion, what are areas that Spinnaker can grow into? I think the idea of delivering different types of software, such as, phone apps, or CDN type applications, are both very interesting angles because they slightly change what deployment actually means. That's an interesting and challenging one to get across. So I'm still trying. I'll get there eventually. Like you talked about server side. Actually, we are back to technology. We're talking about. I know already. It's hard to. So if somebody asks you what is serverless, then it's even bigger trouble. Yes, it's sort of server-side software, but without a server. Yeah, no, exactly. It's very difficult. So thank you, Andy, a lot for talking to me today, and hopefully we'll see you again at other open source events, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you so much. Great. Thanks a lot.